welcome back to Just Liberty, my friends, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Alan Rauch, president of the Church State Council, here with my co-host, Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine. And we are trying, I think somewhat successfully, to take back religious liberty from the political extremes. Our show today is going to be very, 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 very interesting. Does Christianity have a work to do in supporting liberal democracy? And is it succeeding or failing? Because the author we're going to be interviewing today, the subtitle of his book is Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. And so, Bettina, I'm going to let you introduce our guest.
We are absolutely delighted to have with us today Jonathan Rauch. He is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. He's an award-winning journalist and he's a contributing writer for the Atlantic magazine. He's also the author of more than a dozen books, and we are going to be talking today about his most recent book, one that I simply could not put down. It is called Cross Purposes: Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy, which is out now, and you can find that wherever you buy your books. So, Jonathan, welcome to the program.
I'm happy to be here, and only so that I don't self-aggrandize. I think my book total's probably 8.
That should be the worst mistake we make today, right?
Yeah, let's hope it's a worse mistake.
By the time this show airs, it'll be 12.
So, all right, I'm going to throw out the first question then, because, I'm just thinking about the title, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. Well, what was the bargain in the first place? That's what I want to know.
So so the bargain was not, America's going to be a Christian nation. There was a fight about that right at the beginning, and the founders deliberately chose not to mention Christianity or Jesus or any other religion in the founding documents. But they did tell us, Hamilton told us, Adams, Washington, Madison, they all said, we can give you a system of government, but you have to bring from outside that system what they call the Republican virtues that are required to run it. And they expected Americans to get those Republican virtues in civil society, which meant family and community and schools, but it importantly meant Christianity. It meant to them white Protestant Christianity, which is the country's founding faith. So they expected that Christianity would have a job to do in the Republic of socializing Americans into norms like truthfulness and civility and lawfulness and being well-informed and a good citizen. Treating other people the way you would want to be treated, otherwise known in a liberal context as recognizing other people's rights. And they warned us that if we lost those Republican virtues, if that job didn't get done, the whole system could not survive. So that's why I wrote this book. I'm secular, I'm an atheist, I'm gay, I'm Jewish, but it's Christianity is no longer seemingly able or perhaps willing to do the job that it once did in the way that it did, and I think that's creating a crisis for the whole country.
It was interesting to me to discover that this is not a position or a view that you've always had. In a way, you've come on a bit of a journey regarding the role or the job that Christianity does within the American Republic. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Even as recently as, 2003, which is just over 20 years ago, I was still a pretty militant secularist, and I was the dumbest thing I ever wrote was an article for the Atlantic magazine celebrating secularization. I called it a great civilizational advance because as we have less and less religion, we'll have less bigotry and less dogma, and we'll all get along better. And boy, was I wrong.
So what prompted your awareness that you were wrong?
Well, right around the time I wrote that article, 2003, we were on the threshold of an unprecedented collapse of Christianity. in America. Waves of secularization. It wasn't brand new. It really started in the last half or third of the 20th century, but it just really took off. And just in this century, which is still young, we saw the percentage of Americans who belong to a church fall from 70%, which it had been throughout the whole 20th century, to under 50%. We saw the percentage of Americans who said they were observant Christians fall from 45% to 25%. You can go on and on with these numbers. Where were they going? They were becoming, many of them, nones, N-O-N-E-S, people unaffiliated with any religion. So my prediction in 2003 was everyone will be happier. We'll all be more relaxed about life. The opposite happened. All of the social indicators on loneliness, anxiety, depression, social isolation, anomie, anger, fear, all of those went up. Worse than that, we began to see the rise of substitute religions, which could not do the job the founders wanted. Soul Cycle and Wicca and crystals and psychedelics and fitness and whatever. They have their benefits, but those benefits don't include a 2 or 3,000-year-old tradition that deeply cultivates ethics and a transcendent sense of being. And then the worst thing of all that happened, which is it's just really been devastating for our self-government, is that politics became a substitute for religion. People began to take their partisan political identities, conservative, progressive, Republican, Democratic, as the source of identity and meaning in their life, and every election became an apocalyptic contest between good and evil, and that's a burden politics can't bear. Politics is supposed to be about transaction and negotiation and getting along together.
And
So
compromise.
once compromise, all of those things, once politics becomes sanctified,
Yeah.
we become this radicalized, polarized country that we've turned into. And I think, there's lots of reasons for that, but I can't get around the fact that the collapse of white Protestantism is right up there.
Well, as I was thinking about doing this interview and listening to some of your other interviews, I was thinking about an interview we did some months ago uh, with Brian Kaler, Bettina, about how it was that the mainline churches really carried the water for American civil religion through the middle of the 20th century. And then, kind of as they were fading, that the evangelical right picked up, so to speak, the role of really being in the mainstream of American civil religion. I've always been a critic of American civil religion, but I kind of hear you saying that in a sense we need a more robust rather than a weaker civil religion that recovers some of these basic values.
Well, let me put a finer point on that, Alan, because I think you're headed in the right direction. But there are books and articles that say religion is good for you, so be more religious. Ross Douthat's just published one. This is not one of those books. This is a book about Christianity, and it aims at a Christian audience, and it's about the particular message of Jesus Christ that makes Christianity unique. So it's not a generic argument. This is saying that the three core pillars of Christianity, the three things that make it distinctive as a world religion, are also three core pillars of what the founders called Republican virtue, of liberal democracy. And that means we can probably should talk about what those three pillars are. But that means that Christianity has within itself the elements that can help to heal and elevate our country if it will only elevate them within the church instead of doing what it's doing now, which is the opposite, which is a church that's based on fear and culture war and a sense of constant threat.
So, what is liberal democracy? Small L, liberal democracy. How would you define that?
Well, liberalism is, it gets very complicated in a hurry, but the simplest, most basic definition of liberalism is It's the doctrine that all humans are born free and equal.
Mhm.
And liberal democracy is that form of democracy which is liberal, which is to say, it's not just a majority vote. It also constrains the government to observe the rights of the people to be free and equal. So the democratic government, it can vote to help protect people's freedom and to
Mhm.
protect their equality. It cannot, for example, strip Seventh-day Adventists of their right to worship. That's not free and equal.
So you mentioned three principles or pillars uh, that you think the church really needs to return to, or why don't you go ahead and describe those?
Number one, don't be afraid. The most frequently repeated injunction in the Christian Bible.
And in the
There's a
Hebrew Bible.
wonderful, there's a wonderful uh, parable in the New Testament. Jesus and the apostles are in a ship and a storm comes up and it's very dangerous and the apostles think they're going to drown and they run to Jesus and they say, "Lord, save us from this." And he's asleep and he just wakes up and says, "Be calm." And of course, that's a metaphor for the scary world that we live in. It is scary, but Christianity counsels calm in the face of danger and threat, keeping an eye on the next world, not this world. And you always make better decisions if you don't panic. Number two, imitate Jesus. So Jesus's great contributions, there are many. He's an extraordinary figure. But at his core, first of all, he is an egalitarian who believes in the fundamental and equal dignity of every human individual. And he consistently emphasizes the dignity of the poorest and most downtrodden. And that leads to a second principle, which is you judge your society and yourself not by how rich you are or powerful or your status, but how well you treat the least of these. You look down instead of up. Radical principles. The third, forgive each other. Retribution, revenge, judgment belong to God, not to man. Now, these three principles, it turns out, if you think about it for as long as, I don't know, 10 seconds, you see how directly they translate into the core principles of liberal democracy. I mean, there are other principles, right? But these are essential. First, don't be afraid. The founders warned us that the biggest threat to liberal democracy will be a demagogue who stirs up and mobilizes fear in the population to seize power. And they also told us, look, sometimes you're going to lose an election. You're going to have to be willing to do that. Don't be afraid. It's not the end of the world. You're going to learn something from it. The whole country eventually will benefit. You can't have a liberal democracy if everyone is in a constant state of existential fear of losing the next election, or if they try to steal the next election or deny the next election. Or if a demagogue comes along and says, your country's being invaded by immigrants and only I can protect you, well, that's dangerous. Number two, imitate Jesus. So that egalitarian principle, we already talked about that. That is the core of liberalism. That is Kant, the greatest liberal ethicist, the categorical imperative, the imperative always to treat human beings as ends in themselves, never as ends to a mean. Every individual has fundamental dignity which the state can never strip away or deny. That's right out of Jesus. And second, the hallmark of a liberal democracy is it protects its minorities. That's why we have a Bill of Rights. There's some things majorities just cannot do to minorities. That again, right out of Jesus. Third, forgive each other. This translates over into the principle of forbearance in a liberal democracy, which is sometimes you win an election. So what you're trying to do in politics is not crush the other side, drive them out of the polis, and salt the soil with the tears of their women and children. If you win an election, you're going to share the country. You're going to treat the other side with the way you want to be treated. When they win the election with civility and decency, they're still your fellow citizens. So if someone comes along and says, I am your retribution, that person, whoever that may be, is not talking like a liberal, and is not talking like a Christian. So I look at this parallel, and I see in Christianity the core elements that are necessary to help restore the strength of our democracy. I see a natural alignment, and I see, tragically, a skewing of that alignment as liberal democracy and Christianity, white evangelicalism, have gone in opposite directions.
So, you're arguing for not only the fundamental compatibility between Christianity and liberal democracy, but, you know, they are actually mutually reinforcing, or at least Christianity is reinforcing.
They need each other.
They
They
need
need
it.
each other.
However, there is a growing sense of incompatibility, at least on the part of some Christians. They say liberal democracy has sown the seeds of our current moral decay, and that Christianity, in fact, is incompatible with a society which allows individuals to express themselves to the extent that they currently do. So, in other words, post liberalism, it's becoming at least an intellectual area of great potency. And then you, at the other end of the spectrum, you have religious populism. So you sort of have the intellectual side, and you have the sort of emotional side, which both sides are basically saying liberal democracy is not for Christianity. Where do you see this all going? How do you diagnose where we currently are?
Well, I worry about it. I worry about the post-liberal movement for just the reasons that you cite, Bettina. I think it's incorrect. I think we have 250 years almost of history in this country showing and that Christianity and democracy, liberal democracy, work very well together. Tocqueville came to the United States in the 1830s, and the first thing that he remarks on is how these two strands strengthen each other. And they need each other. They help to complete each other. They're always in tension, and that part of the post-liberal critique is true. It is challenging to be a person of faith in a secular democratic country, and it always has been, and it always will be. On the other hand, our secular democratic republic, partly thanks to the work of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, is the most religiously diverse and tolerant that's ever existed. Um, it is the best environment, not the worst environment for people of faith. And if you don't believe that, you can go live in communist China or the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany or what have you. The post-liberals will not tell us what the regime actually should look like or what country they would rather live in. And I think there's a reason for that, which is this one's pretty darn good. So I will, I agree, it is challenging to be counterculturally Christian in today's America. It has always been difficult to be counterculturally Christian. It was very difficult for Jesus Christ to be counterculturally Christian. And if you know what happened to him, you will see that that's the case. Christianity is, Christians tell me, at its strongest, not its weakest, when it's at its most countercultural, when it is not trying to dominate the public space, when it is not trying to run the country, when instead it is bearing witness from the outside, when it is, um, as Mark Labberton has put it, exilic. What the church is doing now, which is wholesale partisanship, and now we're talking about the white evangelical church, not the black church, not Catholicism, and so forth. The white evangelical church has effectively merged with the Republican Party. And we can talk into how that happened and why. But as a result of that, it has increasingly, and I think unfortunately rather accurately, been perceived as seduced by power, by political power. That's the opposite of the message of the gospel. And perhaps not coincidentally, the white evangelical church is collapsing at an alarming rate. And Russell Moore says, and others look at this and say, well, if you want to know why young people are leaving the church, maybe it's because if all we offer them is a choice between politicization and paganization, they'll choose one or the other. But guess what? If you're going to be politicized or paganized, you don't have to give up a Sunday.
You know, I've been smiling listening to you. For starters, at least the first two of your three pillars have been the primary focus of my preaching in churches for several years now. Do not fear, and the passage, it's a judgment parable about the least of these. And,
Bless you, brother.
you know, but thinking back on your core premise about the affinity of Christianity and liberalism, uh, there's been some very good work done, including by one of our Adventist colleagues, Nick Miller, tracing from the early days of the Protestant Reformation concepts of religious freedom and the separation of church and state that eventually found expression with John Milton, with John Locke, and then with our founding fathers. And the idea that if really matters of conscience, the majority has no power, which was one of the watch cries of the early Protestant princes, then how that principle plays out is in equality and in a secular liberal democracy where the state does not exercise authority over matters of conscience and matters of faith and worship. But, these days it seems like the post-liberal answer to liberalism is to have the state assist the church in its religious mission of defining, moral truth and in the supposed name of liberty, actually restricting freedom, in at least for some peoples.
Yes, and so-called religious nationalism, Christian nationalism is one aspect of that movement. The founders, I think, were right to understand that it is socially and governmentally hazardous for any one religion or faction to try to run a diverse country like ours. It's just not going to be possible. But they were also right, and perhaps more importantly, to see that wielding that kind of power would corrupt the witness of the church. And we know from experience with Christendom in Europe that power and the church, ultimately, this is not a good idea for the church. But that's right. Yeah, so we see attacks on liberalism from both sides, and often it is religiously inspired. But Alan, I am personally not as concerned about the post-liberal movement, which is led largely by Catholic intellectuals. It has a following. It's not unimportant. And by the way, not everything it says is wrong. They are correct that secular liberals like me have not done enough to be welcoming to people of faith. And some of the work that you guys do in your church is trying to rectify some of those imbalances. But that said, what I'm more worried about is the politicization of the ordinary people in the pews. What ministers say, what pastors say is that people are coming to church all loaded up with the culture wars. Pastors say we get them for 2 hours a week if we're lucky, and cable news gets them for 12 or more than 12. And they're coming to church with what one pastor told me is a battlefield mindset. We're under siege, our religion, our values, our culture, our children are under siege, and we have got to fight. And if you, the pastor, won't lead us in that fight, we're finding another church. Now, it's not that everyone is doing this, but this seems to be changing the complexion of the church. So people who are there as spiritual seekers are drifting away. They're becoming these nuns. And people who are really just interested in partisan politics primarily and who may not even attend church are increasingly identifying into the church as evangelicals. Crazy statistic. 20 years ago, the number of white evangelicals who never went to church was very small, like 3 to 5%. I mean, why call yourself an evangelical if you never go to church? Today, it's 1 in 8. So the complexion of the church is changing, and that's what I mean when I say it doesn't seem to be willing or perhaps able to do the job of the founders wanted of socializing people into these liberal values, right? Because the church itself is losing touch with those values.
It's interesting because the majority of my working life was in the international space regarding religious freedom. And what you're describing is not just exclusive to America. This idea that religion becomes a national identity marker more than it becomes a faith marker. For instance, in India, where to be a true Indian is to be a Hindu, and if you're outside that particular religion, then you are suspect just simply by virtue of your religious identity. Um, and I think here in the US, and especially through the eyes of someone who comes from a very secular country, Australia, the extent to which religion and national identity is intertwined is just stunning. It's an unconscious assumption that many Christians make and many non-Christians make, that to be truly American, you have to be Christian, Protestant Christian, and and preferably
White Protestant
white
Christian.
Protestant Christian.
Yeah, well, it's the founding faith, and it's had this cultural supremacy is too strong a word, but maybe cultural predominance or prevalence for over 200 years. And sociologists say that this fear, this sense of threat that has come to define so much of modern white evangelicalism, and which is the appeal of Trump and the MAGA movement, that this comes from its gradual but steady diminution from that peak of cultural influence to something less than that. So yeah, that seems to be happening. The one thing that's interesting about religious nationalism, but particularly Christian nationalism, it's hard to define. There are lots of different definitions, but the one thing that scholars who look at it always say is that it is not, in fact, a religious movement.
Right.
It's a secular movement. It's about secular political power. It adopts symbols of Christianity, but it is not, in fact, Christian. And that's important to understand.
So
Yeah.
I want to come back to what I think is a tension in what I hear you saying, because a few moments ago, you talked about Christianity as countercultural. And when I first started out in religious liberty work several decades ago, and I'd hear leaders on the conservative right talking about how we're being persecuted and all of that, I'm like, well, Jesus told us that our values would be countercultural, essentially. We should not expect. I mean, this is exactly what we should expect if we're Christian, is a certain amount of rejection, right? So, but then on the other hand, we do have this very uh, profound, not only kind of civil religion, but as you're saying, these principles that have done a lot of heavy lifting historically for liberal democracy in America. So, how do you kind of sort out the tension between, on the one hand, Christianity being countercultural, and on the other hand, providing some of these key pillars that are necessary? And I agree that they are absolutely necessary to support a liberal democracy.
Well, I'm not even sure that's really a tension. Um, I guess I would say that both in Christianity and in the secular world, those principles that we've been talking about, whether the secular version or the Christian version, are always counterintuitive, and they are always difficult to socialize. And every day we liberals, people who believe in the vision of the founders, I don't mean leftist progressives, I mean people who believe in limited government and the rule of law and all of those things, basic equality and rights. we have to get up every morning, explain why those are important from scratch all over again. Liberalism and Christianity are, in that sense, both deeply countercultural faiths. Liberalism asks you, just for example, to trust people you have never met and will never meet to obey the law. You're going to obey it because of this implicit social contract with total strangers. Um, it asks you to accept when you lose an election and the other side takes power. Nothing could be more countercultural and counterintuitive than freedom of speech. The doctrine that bigoted and blasphemous and wrong-headed and offensive speech should not only be allowed but protected by the government, that's just crazy, except that it works. Freedom of religion. Whoever tried that before? That's a completely crazy idea because all the other religions are wrong and mine is right. So I could go on. But the point is, both of these are countercultural faiths, and that's why they need each other, right? You're fighting human nature in some sense with both of these systems.
So, do you think that the left has also, to a degree, lost faith with liberal democracy?
Is that a trick question?
No, no,
Yes. Yes, I
that's
do. I do. Yes, I do. Yes. My answer
because
is yes.
we've been talking about Christianity losing faith with liberal democracy, but, there is a good case to be made, right, that many on the left have also lost sight of many of those virtues
Yes.
that are needed to sustain what you've just described, countercultural,
So
element.
this is the great problem of our time, right, Bettina? It's that you've got a coalition of the center left and the center right who are profoundly liberal in the sense that we're talking about throughout. Again, not left wing, but believe in the core ideas of the rule of law and democracy and equality and free markets and freedom, but constrained freedom. Um, and then you've got, this is the famous horseshoe. You've got people on the left and you got people on the right who have nothing in common except that they are illiberal and enemies of the liberal regime. And what we have come to understand, we liberals, what we've learned the hard way in the past 20 years, as you've seen the revolution of wokeness on the one hand, radical wokeness on the one hand, and then radical MAGA on the other, is that the illiberal left and right are more alike than they are different. That the fundamental divide here is not between left and right, it's liberal versus illiberal.
I certainly agree, and I have made that actually part of my preaching to explain to our Adventist church members that you are liberal, but not, in the sense of your politics, in the sense of your Christian values and your American democratic values, and help them to sort out what's the difference
Well, thank
between
you.
liberal and illiberal. Because I think, you know, we have increasingly seen illiberalism on both the left and the right, and both of them are certainly a threat to religious liberty. Um, but anymore, I've said for decades that we Seventh-day Adventists are in what I call the lonely middle, because we're not culture warriors. We're not, on either. We're not secular left. We're not religious right, and in between there is kind of a lonely place to occupy. But
You know who else was in a lonely place, Alan? Your Lord and Savior.
fair enough. It has been so much fun for me to hear you as an atheist gay Jew nailing it on these fundamental principles of Christianity. That has just been a
Well,
delight.
it gives me hope. There's been a change in the last 10 years. Something that the post-liberals are kind of right about is secularization got too militant. And it is not necessary for every single mom and pop baker in the country to bake a wedding cake to every single same-sex couple that wants to get married. We just don't need that. It's not a reasonable thing to ask. And I think there is growing consciousness of the importance of religion and Christianity and the damage that we on the secular side have done by taking taking faith contributions to our society for granted for too long.
I think this whole conversation gives me hope. I mean, it's been just an enlightening conversation with you. And as we wrap up, I just want to remind everyone, if you haven't already, get Cross Purposes: Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. It is a thought-provoking book and one well worth the time to read it. So thank you so much, Jonathan, for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's a privilege.
Well, that was a fascinating interview, Alan. And for me, what was so great about it was that so often we talk about Christianity's role in democracy in very binary terms. We're either trying to expunge it completely from the political realm, or we're trying to bring it in so fully that it's kind of steering the whole ship of American democracy. But what Jonathan was talking about was a middle path where Christianity has a productive and important role to play, um, that is neither a Christian nationalist perspective or, hostile to Christianity. This is refreshing.
Well, look, what he's recognizing, I didn't say this in the discussion, but some of us who've been thinking about these issues for many years realize that our nation is living on borrowed cultural capital. That the Protestant values, the Christian values that he was talking about, these are the foundation of our liberal democracy. And if we lose them, and if the church loses them, then we're in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that was really brought out in the interview today. Okay, then until next time, let's keep thinking and talking about religious liberty, bringing it back from the political extremes. I'm Bettina Krause with my co host, Alan Reinach. And remember, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.